Hello and welcome to Our Voices. I am Semenyi Sheikh Oye and I'm joined by my co-host Orian Itangishaka and guest host Palestine Iman. Today we'll be talking about gender-based violence in Sub-Saharan Africa. Ladies, the world is observing the 16-day activism to end violence against women and girls. Now, this is the most pervasive human rights violation. But sadly, reports indicate that it only keeps increasing. How is it like in your regions? Oriel, let me start with you.
Thank you, Semenish. And in our region, one of the things that continuously continue to be seen is silence by the victims. I mean, silence by the victim, and mostly because of a conservative culture. A lot of times things are covered up because of wanting to keep things under the carpet in the religious community and in the community at large. One of the other things that's being reported is that things like rape are very difficult to prove. Now, the UNFPA, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this a little further, is trying to do something in that regards in terms of building forensic centers. They have done that in Kampala and are trying to do that also in Burundi. The other thing is that they're asking, the campaigners are asking that influential women help vulnerable and less privileged women to come out and speak. They find that women of influence are able to really contribute greatly in helping other women to come out and to let their voices be heard.
These are encouraging efforts. We'll be talking shortly.
Yeah,
what about you?
If you look, gender-based violence is different forms. So some of them, I think it's reducing. Some of them is going up, especially during the COVID time, everywhere around the world. This is not only an Africa issue or Sub-Saharan issue, but this is a global issue. So you see like the physical one, the emotional one is everywhere. But the one that I can say particularly in my country is the physical one and the sexual one.
Yeah, as you said, conflict, COVID, and what you said, the silence are some of the reasons that contribute to the rise of gender-based violence, and we'll be talking more about that. Gender-based violence is rising worldwide, but according to the United Nations, the East and Sub-Saharan Africa regions have higher rates of sexual violence against women. Recent research conducted by the Partnership for Maternal, Newborn and Child Health shows that conflict, climate change, and COVID combined have created a breeding ground for sexual and gender-based violence for many African countries. On this week's episode of Our Voices, we will reflect on the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence that started on November 25th and look at the various factors that have led to a rise in gender-based violence in Sub-Saharan Africa. We will also ask experts for their ideas on how to step up the fight on sexual violence against women and hear from people on the continent about ongoing efforts to support survivors.
Now, the prevalence of many armed groups in the vast territory of the DRC is said to be one of the causes of the widespread rape and gender-based violence in the country. But experts agree that solutions can be found in the Congolese traditions, beliefs, and norms. So the Congolese government, in collaboration with the United Nations Population Fund, UNFPA, convened a national forum of traditional and religious leaders against gender-based violence. Kali Guye reports from Lubumbashi in DRC.
The Democratic Republic of the Congo is still reeling from gender-based violence. It all started with the 1993 intra-ethnic armed struggles in neighboring Rwanda, which caused a massive influx of Rwandan refugees in the country, poured right into Goma, the capital city of North Kivu, while about the same number of people were entering Bukavu, the capital of South Kivu. Mingling with these displaced persons were troops of the ex-Rwandan armed forces and Interahamwe and Hutu militias of the late Rwandan President Habyarimana. Over the years, gender-based and sexual violence, which was said to be practiced by the armed rebels in the eastern province of North Kivu as a weapon of war, was also used by Congolese soldiers and civilians in cities and peace zones like the capital, Kinshasa. Today, despite all the efforts made by the Congolese government to fight the phenomenon, gender-based violence persists and hinders all development projects. Recently, the Congolese government, through its Ministries of Health, Gender and Family, worked with the United Nations Population Fund to organize the first ever National Forum of Religious and Traditional Leaders in Lubumbashi, the capital of the province of Haut-Katanga. They mobilized some 170 traditional chiefs and religious leaders converging from the 26 provinces of the DRC together to discuss the critical issue of gender-based violence and find new solutions. United Nations Assistant Secretary General and Deputy Executive Director of UNFPA, Jene Keita, traveled to Lubumbashi to join the works of the National Forum of Traditional and Religious Leaders Against Gender-Based Violence.
For the Democratic Republic of Congo, of the reported cases of gender-based violence in 2021, 42% are people under 18. These figures are alarming, but only represent the hidden face of a problem whose magnitude is more serious. Indeed, these figures highlight the barriers that prevent millions of girls and women from exercising their fundamental rights and making choices that influence their health and the quality of their lives and realize their full potential.
Ms. Keita stressed that armed conflicts and terrorism in different countries impact the incidence of gender-based violence in Africa. African states, she added, must accelerate their efforts in the fight against gender-based violence and harmful practices. The governor of the province of Haut-Katanga, Mr. Jacques Kiabula Katwe, presided over the opening ceremony.
I want to urge the participants to give their best of themselves to achieve the expected objectives, in particular the protection of our mothers, our daughters and our sisters. Soon as we return to our respective entities, we convene the population as we usually do through meetings, and we share the message we have just received here.
The immediate plan following this national forum is to accompany the religious and traditional leaders to implement the pledges, the declarations, and the promises that they have made in this country. We are going to follow up.
Participants have expressed their commitment to defend the rights, dignity, and safety of girls and women in the DRC. They say they are convinced that prosperity and sustainable development will only be achieved when there's a good balance between men and women in society. Khalil Gay for VOA News, Lubumbashi, the DRC.
Thanks, Khalil Gay. Gender-based violence can be physical, emotional, sexual, or financial, and be committed by strangers or intimate partners. According to Amnesty International, a human rights defender organizations globally, on average of 30% of all women who have been in relationship have experienced physical and or sexual violence committed against them by their partners. To learn more about the cause of the violence in Africa and how the 16-day activism is helping create awareness, we invited Vlavia Muangovia, Amnesty International Deputy Regional Director for East Africa. Mrs. Muangovia, welcome to Our Voices.
Thank you so much for having me.
Why are women deliberately targeted in the conflict?
When it comes to conflict, or even when it comes to issues such as COVID, as has been mentioned, I think they are an extension of society, only that the circumstances make the situation worse. Someone mentioned that we're in a conservative society, our societies are largely patriarchal, gender inequality characterizes how we relate within our communities. Violence happens within our everyday lives, even when there's no conflict. So when you have a conflict, you find that the situation is now further aggravated, and women and girls become easy targets for violence, both in terms of maybe passing a particular message to a particular community or group, or just because of the stresses of the conflict as it's taking place. So it's really an extension of our everyday existence, where patriarchy, gender inequality, and the hierarchy between men and women, and the easy targets of women and girls is what actually makes us be in the situation that we find ourselves in, even in conflict.
Thank you for that, Ms. Mwangovia. Now, in this year of 2022, what is the main focus of the campaign for the 2022 for the gender-based violence at the moment?
So globally, the campaign is around basically awakening our activism against gender-based violence, like really reigniting the energy. And different entities, different organizations may have different focuses. For Amnesty, for example, this year, one of our focuses has been on Ethiopia and the specific cases of sexual violence that are happening in the conflict. We have seen how all sides that are responsible, all sides of the conflict, be they the Ethiopian federal troops or the Tigray troops, responsible for patterns of rape, sexual slavery, and gender-based violence against women and girls. We are literally seeing rape being used as a weapon of war in the context of the conflict. So the focus of the campaign, at least for us as Amnesty, has been to see how to ensure that justice and accountability does not get forgotten, because we have a peace agreement that has been signed, which is a step in the right direction, but we're not hearing much about justice and accountability for survivors. So the campaign has really been about putting the voices of survivors at the center of any conversation that will take place in the context of this conflict and subsequent peace agreements that will follow. Yeah.
As we saw in DRC earlier, for example, how important is it to include cultural or religious leaders in this fight to end violence against women and girls?
So cultural and religious leaders are what we call opinion shapers, influencers within the communities, even gatekeepers, depending on who you ask. They are responsible because in African societies, in African settings, we have leaders at the local level who ensure that communities are existing in a manner in which they need to exist. So involving them is very critical because they are the ones who will be able to ensure that the messages that we want to pass to the men, to the women, to the girls, to the boys, are actually passed. So basically, it's important to get their blessings and their active participation in the processes at the community level. Otherwise, you will be facing so many barriers and roadblocks as you try to get any change to happen. An example of child marriage or female genital mutilation, you find that these are happening at the community setting. So if your religious leaders or cultural leaders are not aware of the harms that child marriage or FGM causes to women and girls, then you will face a very big barrier if you're going to try and change the norms within our societies and our communities so that we're able to drop some of these harmful practices. But the key also for me is that to ensure that the religious leaders and cultural leaders are not altering the cause of gender equality. They need to be part of the commitment towards gender equality, and therefore it is important to work with religious leaders and cultural leaders who get it and who embrace the message and who are supportive of it.
That's an important point. We are talking to Flavia Mwangovia, Amnesty International's Deputy Regional Director. We will be back with her for more conversation, but it's now time for a break. But before we go, let's remind you of our social media platforms. We are on Facebook at VOA Africa, and our Instagram and Twitter handle is VOA Our Voices. We are also on WhatsApp, and our number is country code +1 202 503 9025. We'll be right back.
From around the world. Let's go.
Welcome back. You are watching Our Voices today. In a light of the 16 days international campaign, we are discussing the different factors that led to the rise of gender-based violence in Sub-Saharan Africa and the ongoing effort to end it. Violence against women is a major human rights violation. However, Only few of these violations are reported to the police due to the fear of consequences, such as stigma, discrimination, or loss of economic support. We talked to a woman who are victims of violence in Nigeria, South Africa, and DRC. They tell us how they endured the effect of the violence and if they receive any support. Let us hear what they told us.
I was a victim of sexual harassment when I was still a student. I was pursuing my university studies. There was one of my professors who necessarily wanted to have sexual relations with me, but I did not accept because he asked me to meet him at his hotel. But I did not go to his appointment. As it wasn't enough, the professor gave me a failure in his course. It was the worst moment in my life. I even wanted to give up on my studies. There was nobody at the university who helped me. But if I endured all this, thanks to my family and relatives, accompanied me with advice. I think that these kinds of situations should not happen to women. We must give them several spaces through which they can denounce all the sexual abuse they know.
Verbal abuse is the worst thing. You know, when somebody looks down on you, degrade you with words and speak to you anyhow and even tear you apart with words, it's very demoralizing, in the sense that, especially when they feel they are too financially dependent on them. When a man feels, some men with this kind of mentality feels they are too financially dependent on them, they talk to you, they talk down on you, and it is indeed heart-wrenching and soul-piercing.
Last time I applied to a local organization whose name I cannot mention. I had submitted all the required applications, and I think I was better able to take on the vacant position. But I was surprised. After a few days, I realized that my application was not accepted. This was the case with the other women candidates. The recruiter had said that he only selected men because women are not capable. So I asked myself if being a woman is a handicap or a defect. I think that this discrimination has to stop, and for it to end, women have to stand up and denounce all this.
Now, Njeri Wamwangi, victim of gender-based violence, could suffer health consequences as well as physiological and sociological impacts, which is why it is important that they receive support. Usikimye, which means don't be silent, is one of such local initiatives in Kenya that provides shelter and safe houses for survivors. Njeri Wamwangi, the founder of the organization and also survivor of a decade of domestic abuse, is joining us via Skype to tell us what kind of support survivors need and how to provide them. Ms. Mwangi, thank you so much for joining us, and I want to also let you know that we hopefully still have with us Flavor Mwangovia on Skype. Sorry about that. I think we might have lost her. Let's have Flavia Mwangovia, who is also helping us to understand more about how to support victims of gender-based violence. Ms. Mwangovia, thank you so much for continuing to be with us for this discussion. We're looking at some of the solutions and what can be done for gender-based violence victims. What are some of the programs that you have seen that are really pushing forward in helping the victims at the moment?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a pity that you couldn't get Njeri, because I think they are doing really fantastic work in Kenya, and I follow the work that they're doing with survivors. And I think it's really, really uplifting what they're able to do in terms of shelters and safe spaces. That is one program that I would cite. But you see, this is an individual undertaking. We need the state to really honor its obligation. We need governments to step up. We cannot have civil society and individuals doing this, filling this gap. It is actually a state responsibility to be able to offer support, psychosocial, health, or otherwise, even legal support to survivors of sexual violence. So some of the programs I've seen include the one-stop centers, where you have a center where a survivor can report and get all the services they need under one roof, as opposed to being pushed from one to the other to the other. The other one is really around sensitizing institutional representatives, be it police, be it medical officials, be it social workers, to be really sensitive to the realities of survivors and be able to understand some of the sensitivities in terms of reporting, because there's so much stigma around sexual violence. So being able to step forward and report your ordeal already is such an act of courage. So we really need our institutions, be it police or health workers, to be able to be sensitized. And I'm seeing in Kenya, for example, we have in certain counties where there's an attempt to really sensitize the relevant officials to be able to support survivors. Another aspect is really centering the voice and agency of survivors, working with them throughout the process and asking them, what do you need at this point? What is it that will be useful to you at this point? As opposed to coming with a top-down approach that is not applicable to all survivors at all times. So really being attuned to and to centering the interest of the particular survivor when it comes to sexual violence. Also, programs in schools are very important. Being able to demystify these conversations, creating safe spaces where students can speak. A lot of sexual violence is happening in the context of schools or with the younger population, so it is important that any program that we have is also embedded within the schooling system, so that those who may be suffering this ordeal are able to get the resolution that they need.
Mm-hmm. Earlier, we talked more about how COVID and conflict contribute to the rise of gender-based violence, but also women continue to face violence even at home by people they trust. But some of these, they don't get reported because of maybe, as you mentioned, also fear of more attack or a fear of judgment from the society. So how do we reach out to those women and provide them help?
It's a very valid point that you raise, and I think there could be multiple approaches to this. I think it's really our ability to create safe spaces, even at the local community level, where women and girls are able to feel safe, and not even just women and girls, because we know gender-based violence is not limited to women and girls, but they are the predominantly affected by violence. But people who have experienced it are able to reach those spaces safely, yes, and be able to.
Earlier you talked about the conflict in northern Ethiopia, in Tigray region, where the rape exists, and how you get access in the region. We know it's isolated. Yeah. It is time for another break. When we come back, we will introduce you a woman who is a strong advocate against the gender-based violence. We will be right back.
We were talking to Flavia Mnangovia from Amnesty International. She's Deputy Director, Regional Director for East Africa. We lost her, her Skype dropped, but thank you so much for joining us and sharing your expertise on this particular issue. Now we have our Woman to Watch segment for this episode. Sierra Leone's First Lady, Her Excellency Madame Fatouma Jabebio, is popular for her stance against gender-based violence. In 2018, she launched the Hands Off Your Girls initiative that aims to put an end to rape, early marriage, teenage pregnancy, and other forms of violence against women and girls. During the recent United Nations General Assembly, our colleague Peter Cloty sat down with her to discuss her campaign. Here is what she had to say about what steps need to be taken to stop gender-based violence, not only in Sierra Leone, but in Africa as a whole.
Sierra Leone's story is a different kind of story within West Africa, because Sierra Leone went through war, 11 years of aggressive war, very brutal war, and we've come out of that. We've come out of that and refused to be victims of war, because we have moved on from that. But then you do have people whose mentality has not been transformed yet. I think that's what the problem is. And for 11 years, for those that actually did not have the opportunity to be educated, they are now men in our society. They don't understand the difference of, is this right or wrong? They don't. And I think it is also a kind of a curse, because the things that they do when they rape women or children in Sierra Leone or Africa as a whole, you must have a mental problem. For a man, a full-grown man, to look at a 3-year-old child and rape them, there must be a problem with you. But is that a justification? You doing it? It is not a justification. So when you do that, we will come after you, and we will make sure, if you have a mental problem, we'll put you in a place where you will not have access to abusing another woman, you know. So I think that transition from war to where we are now, those young kids who went through the process of the war are now men. And some of them, because not all of them, some of them still think what they used to do when they were at the front is acceptable in our society now. So we have to re-educate them and tell them, no, it is not acceptable, because what you used to do then might be acceptable because of the circumstances, but we now live in a free and democratic society. Sierra Leone had 5 elections democratically, and then transition of power from one president to another, and this is the 3rd president since after the declaration of the end of the war. So we have managed to become the 4th most peaceful country in Africa. I think that's a title that we should cherish. So when we see people abusing women, it becomes a concern, because it's unacceptable. You cannot be progressing in all other part of your country's development, but then 52% of your population are suffering because other men think that they are commodities.